Oh, I see a bunch of people have made use of those facilities. So it's truly my pleasure to introduce the introducer of our closing speaker. Namir Anani and I go back to his days in a previous incarnation. He's got a number of friends here from his days at the CRTC, and he now heads up the Information and Communications Technology Council of Canada. And really, from a conversation that he and I had when he first came on the job, came the idea to approach our closing keynote to be a part of this event. So it really gives me pleasure to have Namir come up to make that introduction.
Thank you, Mark and Michael, for a very engaging and certainly thought-provoking conference. You've managed to do this again, so congratulations. So the Information and Communications Technology Council, we're a national leader in talent solutions for the digital economy through our skills forecast, technology research, but also policy development and programs that we put across the country through many of the academic institutions. We help develop the workforce of the future for the digital economy. And I think it's fair to say that in the next number of years, with the demand far outpacing the supply in this environment, and let alone some of the emerging sectors that were talked about, such as the apps and development, the cloud computing, and certainly the mobile as it advances, I think the talent issue is going to be an issue of much debate in the next number of years as Canada positions itself in the digital economy. Without further ado, it's certainly my great pleasure to introduce a person who is recognized as a champion of Canada's digital economy. His knowledge, vision, and leadership on technology and business issues and trends draws international attention. He is Executive Chairman and Chief Strategy Officer for Canada's top software company, Waterloo-based OpenText Corporation. He has been involved with the internet since it's emerged as a major public network in the early 1990s and has pioneered many of the technologies commonly used today to manage digital content within organization. Just a few of his contributions include, he's the chair of the Government of Canada Research and Development Policy Review Panel, which received, as you probably heard, the $7 billion federal public spending program, which released a report entitled Innovation Canada, a call to action in October of 2012. He's also the chair of the Premier of Ontario's Roundtable on Innovation. He's also the chair of the Canadian Digital Media Network, the CDMN, which coordinates commercialization activities in the digital economy throughout Canada. He's the founder also of Communitech, the Waterloo Region's Technology Association. He's appointed member of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and past appointee of member of the Government of Canada's Competition Policy Review Panel and the Province of Ontario's Commercialization Network Review Committee. If all that wasn't enough, in his spare time he authors several books that I'm sure he can expand on. And it's not surprising that he's recognized as one of Canada's 100 most influential people in the world of knowledge management for the 5 years in a row. And on December 30th of 2011, he was named an Officer of the Order of Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Tom Jenkins.
Thanks a lot. Well, you've already seen me once this morning, so I'm going to talk about something completely different than what we talked about this morning. I'm going to finish off the conference with a bit of a view on multiple dimensions of what you might expect over the next 5 years. And I'm going to try and do this. I'm an engineer, so I'm going to do a lot of economics and government policy stuff at the beginning to set the stage so that you get an idea of the pressures that are going to be on various actors within Canada that you're going to have to deal with. And as we've talked about in this conference thus far, there's a lot of change going on. Well, that's changing competition, changing customers, and therefore changing policy environments. So if you think right now everything is dominated by, let's say, Industry Canada or the CRTC, no. There are a lot of other pressures coming. And it's by its nature the changing environment of the technology itself, because it's transformative. So let me start with the following. A crow was sitting on a tree doing nothing all day. A small rabbit saw the crow and asked him, "Can I also sit like you and do nothing all day long?" The crow answered, "Sure, why not?" So the rabbit sat on the ground below the crow and rested. All of a sudden, a fox appeared, jumped on the rabbit, and ate it. And of course, the management lesson is to be sitting and doing nothing, you must be sitting very, very high up. And that is a huge challenge for this industry. Status quo, no way. It's changing too rapidly. And this is the great dilemma, and something I had talked about this morning, that in the private sector, we cannot simply wait for something to happen to us. In the private sector, it's far better to start to advocate for something and provide a vision for the future that many can gather around. And we talked about convergence this morning. We have to be very careful about this. If we kick the can down the road too far, the rest of the world is not staying stable. And you've heard comments referring to others from outside of Canada. We talk about the United States, but the reality is this is a global phenomenon. We have to get this strategy right for Canada, and we better do it soon. And you'll note that I said that it's a digital and telecom strategy. It's really a convergence strategy. It really, and that's part of the challenge we have, is it cuts across so many parts of our society and our economy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that motivation at that macro level, and then go through some reports that you might refer to, and then look at some of the major insights, look at what's going on globally, and then what should we be doing. This slide dominates everything. You may say, what does productivity have to do with me? With bandwidth, with apps, with Google, et cetera. And the reality is that for 30 years, we have declined in relative productivity to our #1 trading partner. No society can withstand this. The generation coming up now is poorer because of this situation of the last 30 years. Most economists believe that the 90s, in many ways, was a lost decade for us. It caused this decline in our overall productivity. Now, why does that impact this room? Look at the note at the bottom. Report after report cite, and economists like to call this multi-factor productivity, and they'll give you all these different words, but the reality is this is not about working harder for less money. That's a Main Street view of productivity. This is about working smarter. It's about generating more things for the same hour. And it's because you employ digital and telecom tools to be able to do that. As I had mentioned this morning, I've spent most of my life outside the country. I can guarantee you, when I come back to Canada, we are not adopting technologies as fast as some other jurisdictions in the world. 75% of this national dilemma is due to everything you talked about in the last 3 days. So don't think that the conversation will only stay within these 4 walls. If you're in the oil sands, you care about this. If you're in agriculture, you care about this, and so on. Every sector of the Canadian economy cares about this. And in fact, Roger Martin at the Rotman School, in his institute there, he's been studying this for a decade. This is costing every Canadian $12,800 a year. Let me repeat that. If you're a worker in Indiana and you go across the border to Ontario, it just costs you $12,800 a year. That's what this gap means now. So don't think that this is an Industry Canada bandwidth telecom issue. This is a societal issue. Elections will be decided about this. It'll be called different things, and I'll get to that in a second. But at its root, it's about our standard of living for Canadians in the future. So reports on this topic, a good tradition of Canada, we do lots of reports. We study things. And it's good that we study things because then we'll be thoughtful in our implementation. But rest assured, if you want to find out upstream where the pressures are coming to your businesses, it's already there, it's online, you can find it. What you have to figure out is how to read the tea leaves as to how is that going to impact your business. And if you can do that, you have a competitive advantage because you can start to predict the future. And here's the most important issue at a policy level. The elephant in the room, as I like to say, is competition. We'll say we need more R&D investments. We'll say our entrepreneurs need more ambition. It kills me when I hear that. The reality is we need more competition because it is a foundation principle of all these reports. I sat in the OECD and watched a Russian delegation come in to learn how they can increase competitive intensity in their country because they know, and everyone in economics knows, that competition leads to innovation, which leads to productivity. It is the #1 driver. We can talk all we like about all the different things that we should do, but at the end of the day, this is what makes the American economy so productive. So major insights of the report. We can't escape this in Canada. Value chains have gone global. Canada is not an island anymore. Don't kid yourself. We cannot, at the upper layers, even as it comes to the resource sector, whether it's the oil sands, et cetera, we are part of a global value chain now. So we cannot make made in Canada rules, erect the barriers, and expect to be able to be productive and maintain the state of standard of living of Canadians that we saw in the last 30 years. Because of this thing, rise of the brick. You've heard about this for a decade. It is marching just absolutely relentlessly. That we have enjoyed during our entire lives being right beside the largest economy in the world. We happen to speak and share a lot of the same trends with them, but this world is changing, and we have to change with it. But here's the great dilemma. Even though BRIC will have more than 50% of the world GDP, our current export to the BRIC is 3%. We are way out of whack. And part of the issue is we can't compete. So we've got to really fix what's going on inside the country if we're going to maintain that standard of living or close that productivity gap. Now here's a zinger for this group. Roger Martin, again, did a study of global leaders in Canada who can go to BRIC and compete and survive. And forget about BRIC, how about America? Who can go to America, compete, and survive? And his answer was a good one, that from '85 to 2011, we went from 15 global participants to 42 corporations. So when you hear about Canada being hollowed out and what have you, we've actually done well. We've actually, in certain areas, done very well. But again, a zinger for you. Less than 10% of that current total is from something called sectors that have legislation or what are called protected regimes. And yes, you're part of one of the protected regimes. And if you look at the last two bullets, no Canadian telecom made this list. There is no company in this room that's from Canada that is globally competitive. None. And there is no media company in Canada that is globally competitive. None. That's an issue. Sectoral regimes, they're there for a very good reason. The legislation is about 30 years old, and it was what constitutes Canada as a sovereign nation. Most of these regimes in their current form came in at the time we were negotiating NAFTA. And there was a very good reason for them. And some of you, as I mentioned this morning, are being tortured by them because a lot of the commissions and a lot of the rules were there for a time when telecom was really about voice. It wasn't about all the other things in the economy. So the world's changed dramatically, and we know that. And telecom's more important than ever. But guess what? It's a good news, bad news story for you, because the good news is growing demand for telecom goods and services. The bad news, it's even more essential to national productivity. So don't kid yourself. The greater impact on the economy means greater scrutiny and oversight for this industry. It's just logical that it would be so. So you have to realize that if you're part of a protected regime, a protected sector, and that sector is so essential to the rest of society, expect scrutiny and expect more what you would regard as interference, but the reality is the alternative is wide open market. And where this comes to play, recently, in fact, I think it was about a week ago, that cell phone subscription actually hit one per capita. So we actually, I saw an article about that, and that's a good thing to celebrate. But the problem is, the OECD has been producing this chart for 10 years, and we have been at the bottom of this chart compared to all our OECD competitors. So while we can be happy about the mobile rate penetration, the reality is relative to everyone else, and this is a huge indicator of productivity, because it shows how far away we are from the competitors that your upstream customers have to deal with, whether you're Resource Ag Canada, whoever. This is a real key canary in the coal mine for somebody trying to follow policy. Yes, sir? Well, that's an interesting point. One could argue that perhaps they got a little too much debt, right? And they've, it certainly didn't help them, did it? And that's where, you can't take all of this to an extreme. I'm glad you pointed that out, because I take all of this with a grain of salt. But when I see that we're the last for 10 years in a row, then that starts to mean something to me. And in the Competition Policy Review panel, the Wilson panel, we studied this, and I could have shown you about 5 other charts. And you can get into all kinds of disputes about our population density is like Norway and what have you, and so therefore, or our sectoral representation of economy is more like Scandinavia than the Americans or Singapore or Tokyo. So you have to take all of this with a grain of salt, but it is an issue for us, because what is not debated or disputed by anyone is that for 30 years our productivity has gone down. So it's logical, as an engineer, I like to think that if we have suboptimal competition, it'll lead to suboptimal innovation, which leads to suboptimal productivity. It's very logical. And so we have to address this. This is a huge issue for us when we're competing globally. And as you may have read in the last couple of weeks, and this is what I was referring before about how Main Street and politicians get hold of this, this starts to be called Dutch disease. The so-called two-speed economy of Canada. You get one part of Canada talking about petrodollars, you get the other part of Canada talking about the poor productivity in the East. The point being, this is a societal issue. This is an issue far beyond this room. So you should be aware that the role that telecom and digital is playing all through the stream, the cause and effect, the effect is you start to see this as part of the political debate. There's no escaping this. We have to fix this productivity issue. Now, recently, as Namir had mentioned, I also did a panel on innovation. So a lot of this stuff that I showed you earlier was from the competition panel. This one's from the innovation panel. And not surprisingly, given some of the things we just said, our BIRD scores, our business investment in R&D, have stalled. And part of the issue we had is we overwhelmingly incented R&D investment through shreds. And we were right there, I think, with France. We were right there with France. And sometimes from a policy point of view, that's not such a good place to be compared to all of the rest of the OECD. So we really recognized in this panel that we needed to shift away from a single method of incenting R&D. And for many of you that are small companies or deal with small companies in your value chain, no surprise here, we have gaps in our capital structure at the angel side and at the late stage side. So what are others doing internationally? Let's pause for a second. You've heard a lot of this, but understand one thing, and I think you all appreciate that from a bandwidth point of view, but perhaps you may or may not appreciate it. Certainly Kevin referred to it today during the lunch keynote. It's not just about bandwidth. What we're getting is we're morphing The usage patterns, the impact on society is morphing. Social has a long way to go. And having the web as an OS is really going to, we're in early innings of this. This is going to, what I'm trying to convey in this chart is if you think it's changed a lot now, wait. It's going to change dramatically more. And none of us can really forecast how that's going to morph. But it's going to continue to change, and the pace of change will increase. So the second derivative for the engineers in the room is positive here. This is a real dilemma for us as a country, because if we miss the early innings, we're farther and farther behind. Who's going to be the biggest telco in 5 years? If you look at the market caps, hard to say, right? Hard to say. You know, some of the comments today was, you know, I don't know who's friend, who's enemy. Well, the reality is those that are playing upstream in content will absolutely come downstream. If you think of, in the microcosm of what we heard today from Kevin about Bell and CTV, well, we're playing on an international stage. That logic applies there as well. That's going to have a tremendous impact on everybody in this room. That's why we can't stay within our walls and expect everything to work out just fine. YouTube. You know, if you're under 30 in this country, as I mentioned earlier today, your affinity group's completely different than anyone over 30. This is the broadcaster they all follow. BBC, as I mentioned this morning, they were able to turn their psyche on its head and say, okay, we're not really there for 60 million Britons. We are, but we can really make an impact on billions of cell phone users. That involved a tremendous shift in the way they created content, disseminated content, did digital rights management, contracts management. I watched them over an 8-year period completely reshape themselves. I have never seen a Canadian company do anything near to this. And yet, Turner Broadcasting, et cetera, they're all doing this. Why? Because they're in hyper competition. And then, as I mentioned earlier this morning as well, big data. Big data is going to change things. You're already seeing that the easiest example of big data is the recommendation engines within Facebook. Recommendation engines will absolutely dominate the way we monetize things. And unless we get Canadian content digitized, think of it this way. The public web, Google, Facebook, et cetera, it's about 4%. Most people think that's the web. They think, wow, that's big. I go into Google, it'll give me an answer, or Facebook, et cetera. When the reality is the deep web, or the hidden web, is 8 zettabytes, growing incredibly fast, and represents the bulk of the web. But the bulk of the web is behind firewall. And in Canada, we have not digitized inside the firewall. It's a huge issue for our country because much of the conversation going on in this country, besides just the social in-the-moment content creation, the actual water in the water cooler is coming from outside the country. That has a huge impact for us as a culture. And a lot of this stuff, if you're interested in, as Namir was joking, my latest book I just came out with, you can go to the OpenText website and get a download of it. And it describes, because we, in that previous slide, OpenText from Waterloo operates about 1/3 of that deep web. We operate about 1/3 of it. So what should we be doing? The boy rode on the donkey and the old man walked. As they went along, they passed some people who remarked, it was a shame the old man was walking and the boy was riding. The man and boy thought maybe the critics were right, so they changed positions. Later, they passed some people that remarked, what a shame, he makes that little boy walk. They decided they both would walk. Soon they passed some more people who thought they were stupid to walk when they had a decent donkey to ride on. So they both rode the donkey. This is sounding very Canadian. Now they passed some people that shamed them by saying, how awful to put such a load on a poor donkey. The boy and the man said they were probably right, so they decided to carry the donkey. Now we're definitely getting Canadian. As they crossed a bridge, they lost their grip on the animal, fell into the river, and drowned. And of course, the management lesson being, if you try to please everyone, you will eventually lose your ass. And I'd like to say this by way of joke, but that is an issue for us in this room. We have to be very aware that status quo or trying to be peanut butter or trying to keep everybody happy will put us at an incredible competitive disadvantage on the international scene. We have to pick. We have to pick what we're going to be good at. We have to pick where our moments are. We have to pick what we can do that will survive internationally. We cannot use as our bar of competition what goes on inside our little world of 35 million people. We can't do that anymore. You have to lead this as an industry. You have to think about it this way. And I know that's very challenging, but you know, in Waterloo, most of the companies there get up every morning and we think about how we take on the world. And you know, if you just get your head around it, as we were talking about this morning with the reverse diaspora and the opportunities for Canadians, we have such a fantastic brand throughout the world. And so many of you are so clever about playing the game in Canada. You can play the game internationally too, but you do have to change your headspace a bit. So the balanced model for innovation, again, a Roger Martin creation that basically says, okay, Canadian society, we hear all this stuff, we've got to have a balance between putting pressure and supporting what we're going to do. And the competition panel report that I referred to earlier, that's about putting pressure. That's necessity is the mother of invention. Put pressure on firms to satisfy customers. Review the sectoral regimes and figure out ways to increase the pressure without breaking them. The R&D report that just came out is on the other side. How do we support all those Canadian entities? And the 6 recommendations that were put in the report in the fall had a variety of things that dealt with some of the things I observed before, you know, about simplifying the SHRED program, et cetera. And within 4 months, you know, remember, this is 30 years of review of legislation. Within just 4 months, the government's already moved on 3 of the 6 requirements and signaled that they'll consider the other 3. So it's quite remarkable, and this is what I was trying to say before about private sector participation. If you take the time and get involved, government will respond. Why? Because they're on the same team as you. They want what's good for the Canadian economy. Don't confuse that with a self-interested agenda that may not be good for everyone in the Canadian economy. Be honest with yourselves. If you can align consortia such that you really do represent what's in the best interest for all Canadians, you're going to win every time. And they will be behind you every time. I've seen it. Whether it's at the federal level or the provincial level, they really want you to succeed. But it has to be for all. The centers of excellence is one thing I referred to earlier this morning. I just wanted to leave you with this, that when we work together, you know, Canadians are really good at collaborating with each other. When we work together, we can achieve amazing things. No one would ever have thought 2 years ago that we would be, in effect, the virtual secretariat of the most important multilateral virtual environment in the world. You want to talk about Facebook and the Facebook that really matters? Canadians run the Facebook that really matters. Immersive technologies that are being tried out, for example, at the Olympics in London this summer. So in conclusion, this is what we have to do. We're Canadians, we're really good at doing this, but private sector really has to lead this balance. Because what we're talking about is the economic reality of global competition with societal aspirations to remain Canadian, to have national control. You know, we are right beside the 800-pound gorilla. We're very good at this. We're very good at achieving this balance. I've met many countries all over the world who used to have the American economy 2,000, 5,000 kilometers away. The internet brought it as close as they are for us today. And so countries all over the world look to us as to how we achieve that balance. That is a tremendous opportunity for everybody in this room. So my closing thought for you is we've got to figure this out to remain competitive in a world context. So much of our discussions are in a Canadian context. We've really got to start to ask ourselves, how does this play in a world context? And we've got to stop kicking the can down the road. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. At the break, Tom was saying to us he's going to shoot hard. He's going to be a little bit controversial. And we said, oh, that's great. And he said, but maybe I'll tone it down a little bit. After all, I am Canadian. So he said, you are what you are.
Which is why it said kick the can down the road, not kick the ass down the road, I think, was on that closing slide.